All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Franklin, are you still there?
Yes, David, we're about to start the webinar any moment.
Yeah, my slides won't change. Trying to change the slide and it's not working.
Just use the arrow key on your keyboard or click the arrow on your slide when you're in presentation mode, David. That should work.
All right, well, it's not. I'm just telling you, it's not working.
Okay. Well,
so I don't know what I'm supposed to do here.
I can certainly move the slides for you if needs be.
Yeah, the problem is I can't move them.
That's fine. I'll move them. No problem. Thank you.
All right. Okay.
All right. Good afternoon. David, you want to turn your webcam off?
Yeah, I'm trying to get mine. Yeah.
Okay, David, just make sure that you're in slideshow mode with your presentation, and that should make your arrows work to progress your slides.
Yeah. Okay. So at the top again, I've somehow lost that mode. My slides will not change.
Okay, so then you'll have to let Franklin do it for you, and we'll have to resolve this later if there's an issue. I'm not really sure what it is.
Are you seeing the first slide?
Yes.
Okay. Are you now seeing the second slide?
David, please remember right now what people are seeing is, first of all, your webcam, which should be turned off. And they're also seeing the presentation on my computer right now. I have not transferred control to you yet.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so turn your webcam off and we'll get started.
Okay.
You're doing great.
Is it off?
Yes, it is. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth OPUS Winter Webinar Series in the series on the Safe and Accepting Schools policies. And we thank you for joining us for this fourth and final in the series. And just want to remind you that the session will be 45 minutes long today, and there will be time for questions at the end that you can type into the question pane on the right-hand side of your screen. And that any reference to materials, including the presentation outline for this webinar, will be in the Basecamp. The outline is already there, and any reference materials will appear there afterwards, and that also the podcast for this webinar will appear as the others have in Basecamp as well. And we want to thank you for joining us for this series, and welcome you to give us any feedback after the series about future webinar series that you may want to see. And just want to give you a heads up that Opus will be advertising some spring regional sessions later on this week to be happening in April. So you can look for a location and near you, and topics that are going to be very important for schools this coming spring. So we have welcomed David Ferguson back for this 4th webinar in the series, and David is going to be going through today the protocols around first aid, substance use and abuse, weapons, and emergency and crisis response planning. So without further ado, David, you're ready to take over.
Thank you, Barb. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the last in the series of Safe and Accepting Schools webinars. I'll today start out by taking a look at first aid protocols. We'll work our way through the list that you can see there on the title page, and at the end of the presentation, you are welcome to ask whatever questions may occur to you. So the first thing I would like to look at is the slide that indicates the pieces of legislation that are associated with the protocols that we will be discussing today. That would be slide number 3 for those of you who are keeping track. The things that have been added since the last webinar that I presented on the 14th of February are the Youth Criminal Justice Act that and the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act. So those are 2 pieces of legislation that, in addition to the ones that we have discussed already in the past, should be available to you for reference when it comes to our discussion points today. We're going to start off by looking at first aid protocols, and this is primarily a function of the material that is contained within the Ontario Early Years and Child Care Act. So those of you who are running programs for preschoolers or after-care school programs will already be familiar with the fact that the care of children must include first aid and CPR training, and that people working with children in these particular areas need to have that certification. Shockingly, however, as you may not know, schools are exempt from that particular law. Does this mean that there should be nobody in the school trained in first aid and CPR? The answer to that question is no. Schools, like all workplaces in Ontario, are required by the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act to have staff on site at all times trained in first aid. This requirement is enforced by the Ministry of Labor, so it's not a Ministry of Education mandate. In this case, it's a Ministry of Labor mandate in association with the WSIB. And just so you know, it is in place for the protection of the workers. That is your teachers and staff, not the children. So we have legislation that requires first aid training and certification, but it does not require it for students, only for those who are working in an educational environment. This is quite strange from my point of view. However, it is the way it is. That regulation 1101, requires that all employers ensure that first aid boxes and stations are available to employees who hold valid first aid certificates issued by a training agency that is recognized by the WSIB. Despite the current state of affairs, you can expect that parents and students will have an expectation that medical concerns will be adequately addressed. So what that means quite simply is that even though you are not bound by law to be providing first aid attention or first aid activities to your students, it would be an expectation that would be reasonable for people to have. And once again, as we have discussed before, in any kind of litigious situation involving failure to provide such a service would not be looked on with a great deal of favor by the courts. One of the places where you can get CPR and first aid training that is recognized by the WSIB is at the Canadian Red Cross. I provided a website there for those of you who would be interested in pursuing that opportunity. First aid requirements that are recommended for schools by OFIS. It's our opinion that you should have at least one employee on site at all times that has a valid first aid certificate from a WSIB approved training organization. You as the employer or your board must cover the costs for first aid equipment and services that you should have in your school. And that equipment should be inspected at least once every 3 months during the school year. Your first aid stations must be easy to find and near an employee who has a valid first aid certificate. So it's not particularly useful to have an employee with a certificate teaching in a second floor classroom in the south wing and have your first aid station if you only have one in the north part of the first floor. The solution to that problem is obviously to have multiple first aid stations and multiple individuals who have valid first aid certificates. Employers must keep a detailed record of all incidents and any first aid treatment given through the use of an incident report. And where possible, school personnel should receive first aid, CPR, and anaphylactic shock recognition training within 60 days of employment, or it should be a condition of employment. What I would suggest in this particular situation is one of two solutions. One might be to have an actual school nurse, which may not be affordable for some of the smaller schools. And if that isn't possible, then I would make the possession of first aid and CPR training a mandatory condition of employment, the same way that you do with a criminal record check. That may be difficult in situations where you have to replace someone quickly, so therefore that 60-day period of potential for training should be taken seriously. All right, substance use and abuse. The reason I use that title is because there are instances, and they seem to be becoming more and more common, where substance use is just as big a problem as substance abuse. So prescription drugs, as opposed to drugs that are on the restricted list in terms of the law. And we must be cognizant of the distinction and of the fact that we have issues with both. The use and abuse of chemical substances is detrimental to the learning process. I think we all agree with that. Research suggests that the vast majority of students support the need for a clear and judicious policy with respect to the use and abuse of mood-altering substances. Your school should support programs that are designed to raise awareness, to prevent involvement with alcohol and other drugs, to assist and support those who are involved and affected, and to work cooperatively with those who are willing to seek help. The school also needs to recognize the need to clearly establish through a procedural guideline a disciplinary policy regarding the use of tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs. It is the primary objective of the school to assure that the education of all students proceeds in an efficient, orderly, and non-disruptive manner. Possessing, using, actual, or attempted transmitting, buying, selling, or supplying of mood-altering chemicals or look-alike substances or paraphernalia on school premises is an obstacle to that objective and an interference with the rights of other students to receive a quality academic instruction. Now, you will note that in that statement, I am basically equating look-alike substances and paraphernalia with the actual substance or paraphernalia. And I think that's important to note, that we're not just concerned with the actual substance or paraphernalia, but also with the appearance of those look-alike substances that basically create the same sort of atmosphere. Your policy statement on drug use and abuse or substance abuse should include the following. So a general statement of intent, that is explaining to all concerned why your policy is in place. You should be clear about the terms that you are using in your policy. So define things like possession, define things like mood-altering substances, define what you mean by look-alike drugs and drug paraphernalia, and talk about what the jurisdiction is. In other words, what are you relying on as either legislative or policy statements in your own school policy. You should also have something in your policy that deals with right of search. In other words, I often get questions about whether or not you are permitted to search an individual person if you suspect that they may be in possession of an illegal substance. So you will need to spell out the conditions under which you feel that a search is necessary. A personal search is often problematic. Blocker searches and so on, somewhat different. And within certain boundaries, there are precedent for that type of search. You also need to spell out very clearly what offenses that you are going to create consequences for. In other words, what does a student have to do and how far do they have to go in order to initiate a consequence, and what consequence will that be? There are some schools for whom the possession of drugs will result in an immediate removal from the school, but as we have seen in other webinars, this doesn't reflect the current view of progressive discipline. So it's important that we take that into account in deciding what kinds of policies we're going to put in place. While student drug education and referral to counseling resources should be made available to all students, such measures should be viewed as instructional or rehabilitative and will not necessarily be considered as an alternative to the disciplinary measures that you develop for your school. What I mean by that is simply that counseling, if it is required of a student who has been found to be in violation of the drug policy, is probably not a standalone consequence. So make sure that even though you may include that, and probably should include that in your protocol, that there should be more definitive consequences in addition to that in terms of disciplinary measures that you develop for each individual case. The two should be used in tandem as co-anchors of an effective substance use and abuse program. Many current substance abuse abuse policies and protocols place a great deal of emphasis on the promotion of healthy lifestyle choices, usually as a part of the Healthy Active Living program, but also in other courses. Information dissemination is part of the protocol. It talks mainly about drugs and their effects. It uses fear arousal programs. It uses moral suasion. And it talks about self-esteem, responsible decision-making, and interpersonal growth. All of these factors are usually a part of the program in most schools. Here's the problem. Those types of approaches have been largely ineffective. So let me say that again. Those types of approaches have been largely ineffective. particularly I'll go back a slide, the fear arousal programs and the moral suasion programs. All right, those don't seem to have the desired effect. However, approaches which include resistance skills training to teach students about social influences to engage in substance use and specific skills for effectively resisting these pressures alone or in combination with broader-based life skills training do appear to reduce substance abuse. Studies suggest that the reason why these components of drug prevention programs are more effective is because they begin from the premise that youth behaviors with regard to alcohol, tobacco, and drug use are strongly affected by social context, biological and emotional needs, and real and imaginary pressure from peers and others. So if we're effectively dealing with these three elements, we stand a larger chance of being successful than we do otherwise. School-based drug prevention programs. Here are a variety of successful drug prevention programs for your consideration and reference. I have given 3, and I've given their websites if you care to look at those. I don't have time to discuss them in detail today, but you can look them up and do some reading about these programs that have been successful. Weapons. The possession of any type of weapon on school property in school or at any school-sponsored activity or event is unacceptable and illegal. The reference for that, the Ontario Safe Schools Act. Students who are in possession of a weapon, intimidate others with a weapon, display intent to use a weapon or use weapons are subject to suspension or expulsion from school. Now, once again, the suspension and expulsion is a mandated public school response to the program. You are entitled to determine for yourselves what kind of punishment you would exact in this case, but my suspicion is that in the case of weapons, the suspension and expulsion consequence is reasonable. In addition, criminal charges may be filed with the local police service. I think really what you need to worry about in terms of the weapons protocol is making sure that you clearly define what constitutes a weapon. So we tend to think in terms of guns and knives as being weapons, but we often forget about the possibility that other things can be used or other things can be weaponized. So make sure when you are developing your weapon protocol that you're clear about how your school defines weapon. Some schools have suggested that anything that's used that is a physical object that's used to threaten the health or welfare of another can be categorized as a weapon. So the spoon that that student used in the cafeteria to eat their yogurt, if employed in a particular fashion, would be considered a weapon, for example. Theft and vandalism. Policies should be developed based on the notion of mutual respect. So we go back to an earlier webinar where we talked about developing community spirit and a sense of belonging in the school, which evolves into a sense of responsibility for all people and for all property that is a part of the community. So you want to emphasize the responsibility of the perpetrator to make restitution, because vandalism should be categorized by the school as an offense against the school community. So because it is directed at the community at large, the community deserves restitution, and they also deserve an apology. That part of the protocol, I think, should be developed in partnership with all stakeholders in the school community: students, teachers, staff, and parents. Sexual harassment and sexual assault. In our view, school policy should be three-tiered. When I go into schools and look at their protocols, I often see protocols that include harassment that involves students, student-on-student harassment. Sometimes I see student-staff protocols, but not very often. Sometimes I see workplace protocols, but not very often. So when we talk about sexual harassment and sexual assault, the student-student protocol is only one of the three tiers that should be in place. Staff members have a right to feel safe in their environment. Students have a right to feel safe from other students, and students also have a right to feel safe from any kind of unwanted advance from a staff member. It's very important that these protocols be clearly spelled out. Harassment is defined as any repeated and unwelcome intimidation of a verbal, written, or physical nature that endangers an employee's job, undermines an employee's job performance, threatens an employee's economic livelihood. So we're talking here about the safe workplace. This definition of harassment doesn't specifically mention sexual harassment, but sexual harassment is a subcategory of harassment. Normal social contact between people and based on mutual consent does not constitute harassment. Sexual harassment includes, but is not limited to, any form of verbal, written, or physical conduct, slurs, jokes, or graphics that reflects adversely on an individual's gender or sexual orientation. Sexual harassment consists of unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature when submission to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of the individual's employment, or when submission to or rejection of such conduct is used as the basis for employment decisions adversely affecting the employee, or when such conduct has the effect of unreasonably interfering with the individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. We are beginning to see here in Ontario, as has already been seen in various parts of the United States, litigious actions occurring with respect to workplace harassment. And I have a feeling that given the current climate, these are likely to continue, if not expand. Sexual harassment of any student by another student consists of any activity of a sexual nature that is offensive and unwelcome to a reasonable, prudent person of the appropriate same age as the student being harassed, which takes place on the school grounds or during any extracurricular activity and/or social school-sponsored activities. The activity of a sexual nature may consist of requests to perform sexual acts, unwanted touching, and in certain circumstances, lewd comments or gestures. I want to say, in addition to what is here on the slide, that once again, schools should be operating on a continuum. Defining student-on-student sexual harassment or sexual assault will be a far different proposition in a primary school environment than it will be in a high school environment. And the nature of the situation that is being examined need always be taken into account. All right, so you would not be dealing with physical contact that may be unwanted between two 6-year-olds in the same way that you might treat that situation if it involved a 17 or 18-year-old. And we need to keep that in mind when we're writing protocols. Those of you who are in schools that run programs from JK through grade 12, again, will have to develop protocols that address the variety of different climates that you may have within your overall school community. Sexual activity involving an adult and a minor. The actual sexual contact or sexual touching of a student by an adult is sexual abuse, even if the student consents to being touched, and no matter where it takes place. This is a crime, and all staff have a duty to report allegations of such conduct. Any reasonable suspicion of sexual abuse of a minor by an adult must also be reported directly to the Children's Aid Society. What do we mean by sexual abuse of a minor by an adult? Well, once again, this definition includes more than just the possibility of a staff member being involved or a teacher being involved. If you suspect sexual abuse of any type by any adult, related or unrelated, you have to report this to the Children's Aid Society. The following conduct, in fact, creates reasonable suspicion. A request or suggestion by any adult school personnel for any type of sexual conduct, even if it takes place at a time and place unrelated to school activities or educational environment, and even if unrelated to academic decisions. Lewd and suggestive conversation between any adult school personnel with a student, any viewing and showing of sexually explicit pictures by an adult school personnel with a student. I haven't included relatives here, parents, aunts, uncles, and so on, but again, where there's a suspicion, you have a duty to report. Since 2001, Ontario Regulation 52101 has required school boards to collect criminal record checks for all employees and for service providers who have direct and regular contact with students. According to Section 6.3 of the Criminal Records Act, an organization responsible for the well-being of one or more children or vulnerable persons and to whom or to which an application is made for a paid or volunteer position can work directly with a member of a police force or authorized body to conduct a vulnerable sector check. So this means, for all intents and purposes, that all of your staff members and all teachers in your school, all personnel that come into contact with students in your school, must pass a criminal record check. For all students who are categorized as minors, that criminal record check must include a vulnerable sector check. If I were in your position, I would be making the presence of a criminal record check with vulnerable sector endorsement a condition for employment. There are far too many schools out there that I am going into where 3/4 or more of the staff members that are working in that school are working without a criminal record check. You are really taking chances when you allow that to occur, because you're not only breaking the law, you're putting yourself in the position of very bad circumstance should an event occur that could have been prevented by hiring practice that you failed to employ. So please, when I do help schools out, one of the first things that I stress to them is to make sure that all their employees have up-to-date criminal record checks. When I ran my own school, I insisted that those be in place, and I insisted that that they be renewed every 3 years. In the interim, I asked every staff member and every person working with my students, including volunteers, to sign disclaimers indicating that they had no criminal record. That way I could at least rely to some extent on the fact that I was operating in good faith. However, nothing replaces the existence of the criminal record check itself. All right. You must therefore direct any individual who you may require to obtain criminal record checks to do so through police services in the area where they reside. You should consider individual declarations or renewal periods of 2 to 3 years for continuing employees. And as I said, CRC should be listed as a condition of employment and should be in place prior to offering a candidate a position in your school. It escapes me why teachers' colleges do not tell their graduates that one of the things they should do, in addition to presenting their credentials, their academic credentials, one of the things they should do immediately is take care of the criminal record check so that they are in a position to be employed. Emergency and crisis response protocols. The legislative sources that I used in putting together this talk are the provincial model for local police school board protocols, which I believe Barb has discussed in a previous webinar, and Bill 212, which amended the Safe Schools Act's provision of the Education Act in February 2007. This act amended the Education Act in respect of behavior, discipline, and safety. As part of your school safety plan, you should develop a procedure for school evacuations and for dealing with emergency situations when a school cannot be safely evacuated. These procedures include specific plans to keep students, staff, and others safe in the event of a serious accident, violent incident, or act of terror. The school must establish a clear hierarchy of responsibility and command, and drills should occur on a semi-annual basis to establish familiarity. Once again, I've gone into a number of schools where the lockdown and secure procedures, the school safety plan was there but not complete, and where it did not appear that any drilling was occurring to familiarize staff and students with the procedures that they ought to follow. The procedure should clearly lay out the response expected from administration, staff, and students. Sorry about that. Procedures will vary from school to school, but in general should align with the police protocol established in your locale. A minimum of 2 lockdown drills must occur every school year. In the construction of lockdown plans, each school should consider the following guidelines. First, when to lock down. Terminology is very important. Plans should clearly identify when lockdown versus other terminologies to be utilized. Terminology used to order a lockdown should be plain language, clear, and leave no misunderstandings as to what is expected. No secret passwords should be used. One school that I went into this past year had lockdown procedures, but they had a secret password. And unfortunately, the person in the office that was going to be responsible for calling the lockdown had forgotten what the secret password was. So that didn't prove to be very effective. Lockdown should only be used when there's a major incident or threat of school violence within the school or in relation to the school. The over or misuse of lockdowns will result in staff, students becoming desensitized, and they will not take lockdowns as seriously as required. This is already beginning to happen in some of the larger public school boards, where lockdowns are becoming more and more common, and as a result, the effectiveness of the lockdown procedures is being reduced. Hold and secure is the term used to describe a situation where the school is secure due to an ongoing situation outside of the school. During hold and secure, all external doors remain locked, all windows closed, and staff members are posted at all exterior doors. During this response, all movement in and out of the building is restricted. This includes staff, students, parents, and all other visitors. This type of situation is usually initialized by local police services. Shelter in place would be used for an environmental or weather-related situation where it would be necessary to keep all occupants within the school to protect them. This response might be recommended by police, fire department, or EMS. People would be allowed to enter the building, however, they would be required to stay once inside. During this response, you would secure all windows and doors, but normal operations within the school would continue. Barricading. It's just beginning to be considered an appropriate action in Ontario. It's much more common in the United States. It was an action that was taken in the most recent incident in Florida. Unfortunately, it did not stop the shooter in this particular case, but it may have mitigated the result to a certain extent. Barricading is a procedure used to create a further barrier to a classroom or office that would obstruct the entry of an intruder should a locked door be compromised during a lockdown. Widely practiced in American schools post-Sandy Hook, but still under discussion in Ontario. There are a few schools in Ontario that are using barricading, but for the most part, it's a discussion that's still ongoing. A controlled evacuation may occur in the event of a prolonged situation or a situation where the threat has been contained. A controlled evacuation may occur in these instances. Police services are usually the people that decide whether a controlled evacuation will occur, and they are the ones that direct the evacuation process. It's generally done in schools on a room-by-room basis. School administration will coordinate key access to all areas under the direction of police services personnel. So that brings us to the obvious, which is that in order for these kinds of things to work, your school needs to develop a relationship with your local police, and you do that through following the model for the development of the police protocol, which you can find at the website that I have provided on this slide, at the direction of the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. Schools and police services must establish and follow a protocol for the investigation of all school-related occurrences, particularly as they relate to the commission of criminal acts or the safety of the students and their care. This is particularly applicable in instances where the school population is under external or internal threat. Roles and responsibilities. In emergency situations, clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and expectations are critical. So at a minimum, plans should include your expectation of staff, of students, of parents, and of the police. The school emergency response team at minimum should include the principal, secretary, custodian, and specified teachers. So I'm suggesting that each school should have an emergency response team. Roles for each team member should be defined within your school emergency plan. Every school should develop an effective and reliable system of communication that will serve to direct staff and students and parents to the existence of an emergency situation and the appropriate designation of the emergency. In other words, is it hold and secure? Is it a lockdown, etc.? Wherever they may be, in or outside of the building. For instance, when my phys ed class was out of the building, my phys ed teacher carried a portable phone, a mobile, so that if we had to communicate with him or he with us, we had a means of doing that. Within the school itself, we had a PA system that we could use to communicate with each classroom and each classroom with us. Again, there may be small schools out there that do not have the resources to have a school-wide PA system. But in that case, you must put in place some sort of secure communication system that will allow you, in the case of an emergency, to be in touch with all parties. It's very important. Floor plans, accurate floor plans. They are a key component to lockdown plans and are important both from a planning and response standpoint. Floor plans should be posted throughout the school and at least in every classroom and at every entry point to the school. In multi-level buildings, it is suggested only the floor plans relevant to a specific level be posted on each level. So in other words, it's not necessary to have a floor plan of the entire school on the second floor, but rather just a plan of that particular floor will do. Hard copies of floor plans and electronic copies should be provided to the police. It is vitally important that police have current, accurate information about the school layout, and that this information be available in both electronic and hard copy in the event of technology malfunctions. To assist police in responding to a major incident or threat of violence, buildings, entrances, and all rooms within buildings need to be clearly identified. Your school emergency response plan should address the following: emergency contact numbers, severe weather power outage, emergency student dismissal, medical emergencies, biological, chemical emergencies, fire, bomb threat, intruder, lockdown, and evaluation. And I'm sure that in putting this particular slide together, I've missed some that might be included. If any of you have suggestions as to other things that should be addressed, I'd be happy to hear from you on that. Each September, schools should incorporate lockdown information and procedures in formal school communications to parents and guardians. For assistance in formulating procedure customized for your school, please contact OFIS. And that brings to a conclusion today's presentation. So at this point, I'm opening the floor to questions that may have occurred to you during the presentation.
Thank you very much, David, for sharing all of that information with us this afternoon. There's quite a few reference materials that we can add to the base camp depending on what participants would like to see there as well, sort of rooted in what David shared this afternoon. One thing that sprung to my mind immediately was the specifics around establishing first aid stations found in the Workplace Insurance Act of 1997. It's very specific, actually, with respect to the size of your business as to what your first aid station needs to look like. So we could provide that if you would like that. And then just some other things with respect to Bill 168, which is the amendment to the OHSA Act with respect to the workplace and violence policy and procedure requirements for businesses in Ontario as well. What kind of policy needs to be in place, as well as what kind of practices and what kind of a committee structure needs to support your protocols around workplace violence and safety. So we could add that as well. Back when that legislation got royal assent, so 2010, we provided a number of workshops on that from OFIS as well. So many schools already have a policy and protocol in place, but may need to update it since that time. So those were just a few thoughts I had as I listened to what David shared this afternoon. But let's move on to the questions. Feel free to type the questions in the pane on the right side of your screen, and we will get to as many of them as we can in the next 12 minutes or so. The first question we have is whether or not defibrillators, oh my goodness, I always have such a hard time with that word.
No, they're not. Yeah, I know what they're asking.
Yeah, they're just wondering if they're required.
No, but advised. In other words, if you can afford it, you should look into to acquiring it. But as far as I am aware at this point, there is no legislation requiring schools to have defibrillators.
The only other thing I can add to that, David is correct. There's not anything in the WSIB as well for what structure should be of first aid stations. There's nothing in there about defibrillators, AEDs, nothing like that. So he's right. The only other thing you may want to check is with your insurance provider with respect to your general liability insurance. Sometimes there are provisos about first aid requirements that insurance companies add depending on who the provider is and what the policy is specifically. So that's another thing you may want to check to be sure that that aligns.
And I would suggest that for any of the requirements or non-requirements that we have discussed in any of our webinars, I believe I mentioned it in the second webinar, you should always be checking with your insurance provider to make sure that whatever coverage you have allows you to make certain kinds of decisions. So it's always a good idea, no matter what we're talking about, that you make sure that your insurance is appropriate.
Great advice. I think I mentioned that in the webinar last week as well. So it's been a good reminder throughout the series. The next question is, when communicating lockdown procedures to parents and guardians, how much detail or types of details should be shared?
I think what needs to be shared is exactly what it is you expect of each of the stakeholders in the event of a lockdown. I don't think that you're going to find that most schools have lockdown procedures that are different in general. There may be differences, specific differences, depending on what type of school and how many classrooms we're talking about, and so on and so forth. But I always shared my entire lockdown procedure with all stakeholders. Does that answer the question?
I am sure that the person who wrote the question, she just wrote in and said, yes, that answers the question.
Okay.
Okay, so also with respect to emergency plans, crisis plans, some of your local police do require that you submit your plans to them, and that includes floor plans, and that all as a package be submitted to the local authorities, well, obviously ahead of time, not during a crisis, so that should a crisis of any kind occur at your school, they can access that immediately from their end and enact their pieces of it consistently and quickly. And so you want to check. You'll want to check with what your local police have with respect to those requests. I know that in Waterloo region where I live, and I know this because I'm on the Waterloo Regional Police Task Force for School Resources, I know that we do have a requirement here that emergency plans and floor plans be submitted annually to police services, and that they are working at getting around to all of the schools in the region to be sure that they understand what they have to develop, and they even have a template to assist schools in putting together a plan with alerts to what all the pieces are. I do have that plan if any of the schools online today are interested in seeing what that template looks like. It can provide a good guidance for getting started. David is correct though. He did say at the end of his presentation that is the kind of thing that should be customized to each individual school depending on physical features of the school as well as its own internal policies, and OFIS can provide assistance with that. So to that end, we actually had a question that says, who is doing this presentation? And it is David Ferguson, so I can answer that. And it says, are they available for consult? And the answer is yes, they are available for consult with respect to emergency and crisis planning, but maybe with any of the other policy pieces that we've mentioned throughout this series. OFIS can provide consultation to schools that are looking to develop a unique and customized package of school safety policies and protocols. We can do that, and you can contact the office about that for more information. Are there any other questions out there from our participants today? Right, I'm in now, and we still have about 7 minutes left if there are questions. Okay, here's a question. What is the procedure in the case of suspecting a student in possession of a weapon? Do we search the student's belonging, and how do we ensure there's no violation of the student's privacy? David, you did touch on this. Perhaps you could expand a little further.
The first determination that needs to be made is whether you have probable cause. And that's always going to be a matter of each individual circumstance. If the suspicion is only a slight suspicion with no probable cause, then you're stepping on fairly difficult ground if you initiate a search without the permission of the student. But in any case, you need to put the safety of your school and of other individuals at the head of the line. So if you have probable cause, if you have reasonable thoughts, reasonable doubt, then the search shouldn't take place. If you have probable cause, however, and you feel that the threat is imminent, then you should conduct the search. That doesn't mean that there may not be consequences that arise out of that, but you have to weigh that against the risk of not making the search and having something occur. As far as searching things like lockers and so on, that should be part of the protocol of the school in the first place, that the school reserves the right to make those kinds of searches, and you should make those kinds of searches from time to time to ensure that students are aware that storing things like that in their lockers is a bad idea. Now, we also know that people who are likely to be in possession of weapons of some sort are likely to be relatively unstable, so you also have to take into account what the likelihood is of you suffering some sort of physical injury as a result of your intervention. So this is not an easy question. I only had an incident like that once in 35 years of being a teacher and an administrator in school. And in that particular instance, it was not a firearm, it was a knife. And I was able to secure that knife from the student involved without too much difficulty. In fact, the student, once accosted, became quite compliant. I'm not saying that that's likely to happen in all cases, but that's what happened in mine. So that's all I can tell you about that sort of thing. We know that confrontation is a difficult situation regardless. So unfortunately, to some extent, I have to leave you to your own devices on that. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Barb?
Yeah, I was just thinking too that in last week, if you take a look at last week's presentation outline, you will find there the list of items that are mandatory to report to police and the list of items where principals have discretion about reporting to police. And the suspicion of a possession of a weapon is in the list of mandatory things to report. And in the interest of potential injury, as David referenced, the best idea, in my opinion, is to call the police and let them manage that, because their protocols with respect to search and seizure are more defined, and giving it over to professionals to protect this community of the school is a better idea. So in that case, you can call the police and you can let them know what evidence you have and what the basis of your suspicions are about a student being in possession of a weapon. And it doesn't matter what kind of weapon it is. I'm aware of a situation in a school where a student had a small pen knife, just like a pocket knife, and because that student showed that pen knife to another student and made some sort of quasi-threatening comments, the police were called, and the police did take the student into custody, and there was some follow-up action with respect to community service and work with the Johns Hopkins Society and so forth for that student. So then those decisions belong to the police and not to the school community, and sometimes that's the best way to go.
And I agree with you 99% of the time. My reference, however, was to a situation that appears imminent. In other words, someone's in possession of a weapon and it appears as if they're likely to use it.
That makes sense to me.
That's a slightly different situation, but no, 99% of the time, the protocol should be to involve police services.
Yeah. Good distinction. Thank you, David. So we have 2 minutes left. If there are any final questions, I will be kind of going through this presentation again to add to the Basecamp any referenced documents or resources that we have at Opus that could be added there for the benefit of our participants in this series. So you can have a look at that. I will also put a note on the message board when I have added that, as well as the podcast link for today's session. Any final questions? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any. We have 1 minute left, and I just wanted to say one other thing, and that's for any participants who are still considering taking the PSP courses, particularly PSP 1, we do cover an awful lot of policy development stuff during that course, particularly around the operations and management of private schools, and we do have a big section on school safety, obviously, in that course. So if you're looking to develop your specific policies, consider taking that course and working through your policies as a practicum project in that course. And that's a good way to sort of get that addressed in a timed manner of a course and follow-up practicum project. So I just wanted to give that opportunity a promotion as well. So
when would PSP 1 be happening again?
In October of this year.
Next October. Yes.
Well, this year, yes, in 2018.
Yeah, so it's still 6 months from now, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. It is 2 o'clock, and thank you for joining us. We've just received a note from one of our participants saying thank you so much. I learned a lot throughout these 4 webinars. Glad to hear that's the case. And those resources will still be available to you in Basecamp, and David and I are also available through Basecamp as well if you have follow-up questions. Hope you have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. Thanks for joining us.